Tonight, an uprising in Venezuela turned violent. Chaos in Caracas as the opposition makes a play for power and the government fires back. Is this a turning point for a country in turmoil?
12 days, non-stop.
You getting tired?
Exhausted.
They tried all they could to save their homes. Now the Ottawa River is reaching its peak, and there's more rain coming.
It's a pretty scary time.
How a swine fever sweeping China could cost you at the grocery store. This is The National. Venezuela is a country teetering on the edge tonight after a surprise uprising against President Nicolas Maduro, a rebellion that very nearly succeeded. This morning, opposition leader Juan Guaido, flanked by armed troops, called on Venezuelans to rise up against the government. Supporters rushed to his side, and outside a military base in the capital, a battle began with tear gas, water cannon, fire bombs, and fury. Paul Hunter begins our coverage.
On the streets of Caracas, chaos. Anti-government demonstrators taking on police and government troops in what's being called the final phase of efforts to topple Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Defend freedom, he says. Out with tyranny. At one point, a military vehicle rammed into the crowd straight at demonstrators who fell under its giant wheels, their fate unclear. Protesters countered in turn, throwing fire bombs at the vehicle. Said opposition leader Juan Guaido, leading the demonstrations, Venezuelans want change. Indeed, at one point, a signal perhaps government forces were switching sides. Cheering erupted when some soldiers opened an air base to demonstrators who surged in before other soldiers turned them back. Indeed, tonight, the military still backs Maduro, even after word Maduro himself, remarkably, may be set to fold. Says the U.S., he was preparing to flee Venezuela for Cuba this morning.
That Maduro's plane was parked on the tarmac and he was preparing himself to depart is a fact.
Added the U.S., Russia talked Maduro out of it. Meanwhile, said U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton today, the U.S. remains open to using its military to back Guaido.
All options are on the table.
Guaido declared himself president in January and is now recognized by some 50 countries, including Canada and the U.S. But Maduro labels him little more than a U.S. puppet. Bottom line, with the country in a kind of free-fall, demonstrations rage on. Says Guaido, they'll be even bigger tomorrow. He tweeted today to his followers, "This is our moment." Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
Now, Canada's government, which has already declared its support for Juan Guaido, is very concerned about the situation and today made a direct appeal to the president, Nicolas Maduro.
Canada commends their courage, and we call on the Maduro regime to step aside now and allow for a peaceful end to this crisis in line with the Venezuelan Constitution. It is time for Venezuela, in line with its own laws, to return to democracy.
Freeland also announced plans to speak with other Latin American foreign ministers about the crisis. Meanwhile, Venezuelans staged demonstrations in this country today as well. Protesters gathered outside the Venezuelan embassy in Ottawa and in Calgary, calling again on Maduro to step down. Without question, the pressure on Maduro is now immense, but is it enough to push him out? Our Evan Dyer examines the forces against Maduro and those keeping him afloat, at least for now.
When Juan Guaido declared himself president and was recognized by dozens of countries, including Canada, many thought a change of government was imminent. But the armed forces remained loyal to Nicolas Maduro, partly thanks to a fierce witch hunt for military dissenters. In February, we spoke to one non-commissioned officer who said his comrades wanted change, but were scared of their own senior officers. We agreed to protect his identity.
They know they're losing. They know they have no way to control this. They know that people don't believe in their lies anymore. They know that the armed forces are split and that a large number support Juan Guaidó.
Today, many soldiers brought that support into the open.
For the first time, you actually have armed personnel now on both sides of this conflict, which has not been the case up until today.
The hardships afflicting Venezuelans have only grown worse. Inflation is at nearly 2 million%. Money is basically worthless. The rations that Venezuela's government now uses to feed its people are shrinking. Even gasoline, the one cheap thing Venezuelans could count on, is getting scarcer. Venezuela's economy began to collapse 6 years ago when the U.S. was still its biggest customer. But since January this year, the U.S. has stopped buying Venezuela's oil. Perhaps the final straw pushing Venezuelans onto the streets, collapsing infrastructure, leading to nationwide blackouts that last days at a time.
No power in the hospitals, no power in the morgues, crime shooting through the roof. It just increases the death count that much more and drives the desperation of the people of Venezuela.
So is this the final chapter for the Maduro government? It all still depends on Venezuela's soldiers, who today were shooting at each other on the streets of Caracas. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.
And in a video message to his supporters late tonight, opposition leader Juan Guaidó says they will keep advancing Operation Freedom, Ian.
All right, Rosemary, let's turn to a developing story here in Canada. For nearly 2 weeks, communities along the Ottawa River have faced a kind of water torture, day after day rushing to fill sandbags to keep gas pumps running. A grueling round-the-clock race against a rising river, building up defenses towards this moment as the Ottawa River finally begins to peak. The parts of the river that peaked today have exceeded previous records by as much as half a meter. Throughout the week, more peaks are forecast downriver, the beginning of the end of this ordeal. And as Hannah Thibodeau explains, it can't come soon enough.
David Prue struggles to wade through his backyard and stops to stare at his now flooded home. Only days ago, it looked like this. Prue put up a fight with 3,500 sandbags and 8 pumps.
We built a big wall around the house, the sandbags and all. Unfortunately, the water was stronger, so the wall collapsed, and that's when the water started coming. We're going on 12 days now. 12 days, non-stop.
You getting tired?
Exhausted, yes, yeah.
It's the second time his house is flooded in 2 years.
I'd say more discouraged, because we just finished the renos roughly 2 months ago. And landscaping outside is not even completed from the last flood, so.
The basement, once again destroyed, after doing everything they could to protect it.
It's sad. You go through the first one, it's different, stressful. Second one's not as stressful, and I think that's the worst feeling, is losing it, even though you tried so hard, you gave everything. We are tired physically and mentally, and I think that's the worst feeling right now, is knowing that you still lost the house after all that.
Prue has now evacuated, but others are doing everything they can to stay.
This is how we do grocery shopping now. Yeah, there's no running water now. So tomorrow we go grab some big water jugs and try to carry them down.
And today's groceries?
Today's a little bit of stocking up. Fun times.
She's been told once the river finally peaks, it'll be at least 2 weeks before the water starts to go down.
How tired are you right now?
It's no words. No words. It's hard, you know.
But there's still a long way to go. Hannah Thibodeau, CBC News, Gatineau, Quebec.
Ontario's Muskoka River is also causing record-breaking floods, which are set to get worse. The Bracebridge area in Cottage Country is set to get as much as 35 millimeters of rain by Thursday. And to say the ground can't absorb any more water is an understatement. Take this home, swallowed by the mud. This is the 4th major flood in the region since 2010. and a mayor blames poor watershed management. Managing the water, that's a familiar theme in Manitoba. Forecasters expected one of the worst flooding seasons there on record. Instead, a slow thaw and Winnipeg's impressive flood protection has held the waters back. Here's Cameron McIntosh on potential lessons for other parts of Canada.
Here is why Winnipeg isn't flooding right now. That diversion gate is pushing water into the Red River floodway, 47 kilometers around the city. Winnipeg has relied on it 33 of the last 51 years.
This is clearly Manitoba's #1 greatest investment.
Now, this diversion channel was built in the mid-60s at a cost of about $63 million. In 1997, it was pushed to its limits and later expanded at 10 times that cost, covered by the federal and provincial governments. Over 51 years, it's been operated dozens of times, saving as much as an estimated $30 billion in property damage.
In 1950, 1/8 of Winnipeg flooded, forcing 100,000 people from their homes. Considered then the largest, most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history.
Winnipeg decided it had suffered enough.
In 1968, after years of debate, design, and finally, Canada's biggest dig, Winnipeg had its flood channel. So, could something like this work further east?
There are some, useful lessons.
Engineer Slobodan Simonovic knows both the Red River and Ottawa River. The geography differs. Clay in Manitoba versus rock in Ontario and Quebec. Cutting channels around Ottawa and Montreal might not be practical, but he says solutions need to be studied.
The fact is that we see these extreme events being much more common or happening more frequently.
Outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba has also diked communities, raised homes, and forced relocations.
It's certainly far more practical than bailing water out of your basement every 10 years or having to call in the army in order to sandbag your house.
It all requires money and political will.
Let the professionals give you good advice, and then you have to put the tax dollars into it.
For Winnipeg, it's paid for itself more than 30 times over. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Cam mentioned relocation. Kesheshian Reserve in Ontario has been calling for it for years and took that message to Parliament Hill today.
Come February, in April to come, my people are already talking about what's going to happen. Where are we going to go this time?
Kesheshian has been evacuated every spring for the past 17 years. Today in Ottawa, demonstrators demanded an action plan for moving the community to higher ground. The latest promise to do so was 2017.
Ottawa promises money is on the way for farmers across this country, caught in the middle of a diplomatic dispute between Canada and China. Among those hit particularly hard are 43,000 canola growers. With the government bracing for this spat now to drag on, CBC News has learned a major aid package will be unveiled tomorrow morning. Our Katie Simpson is breaking those details tonight.
For 2 months, Canadian canola farmers have anxiously watched as their most important customer slowly shut them out. China has claimed the Canadian seed is contaminated and has blocked large quantities from its country. There's no science to back that claim, so it's widely seen as retaliation for the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. With no end to the dispute in sight, CBC News has learned Ottawa will expand a loan guarantee program for all farmers, which will allow them to borrow more money and faster. Producers will be able to access $1 million through this new plan, up from $400,000. For canola farmers specifically, the interest-free limit will be $500,000, up from $100,000.
It's a high-quality product. The Canadian brand is very strong internationally, and we continue to market it aggressively with the industry.
The Trade Minister will also launch a canola mission to find new markets for the Canadian product. It's a plan that's been in the works for some time, but comes as the opposition has ramped up its attacks on the Prime Minister.
It's Canadian canola producers who are paying for this Prime Minister's weakness on the world stage.
We've been on this issue for the past number of weeks, including in many meetings with various producers.
Ottawa has asked Beijing to allow officials from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to examine the canola in question. Multiple sources say China responded formally in a letter, and while the note is being described overall as positive, China did not specifically address Canada's request. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Ottawa.
Pork producers were also caught in the dispute, but perhaps a bigger factor for them right now is a virus sweeping through Chinese pig herds. As Peter Armstrong explains, if it continues, your summer barbecues are going to get a lot more expensive.
Turns out that simple life ain't quite so simple. Lunchtime on this pig farm, overshadowed by a crisis in the pork industry more than 10,000 kilometers away.
It's a pretty scary time.
Marie Thunberg raises 5 different kinds of heritage pigs in Cambridge, Ontario, but events in China loom large here.
And they're saying this could up the price in pork in Canada for 2 to 3 years, but now they're also saying it could be 5 to 7 years before China replaces all their lost inventory.
This Thunberg refers to is a swine fever sweeping through China. Millions of pigs have already been slaughtered. No country on earth consumes as much pork as China, so a shortage there is quickly felt everywhere.
Inventories in Canada are starting to be depleted. So grocers who want to sell us bacon and ribs will become increasingly desperate to find any product to sell us, especially during the barbecue season.
Canadian pork producers had been victims of the growing trade war between Canada, the U.S., and China. Now, though, the tables have turned. China needs Canadian pork, which should help ease Canada-China talks about canola and soybean exports. At least it will, so long as Canada keeps swine fever out of this country.
If we get a case, we could actually re-experience what we saw back in 2003 with mad cow, when overnight we saw 35 different countries issue an embargo on Canada's cattle industry, and cattle futures went down 70% overnight.
U.S. officials say the most likely way swine fever comes to North America is through the illegal import of pork products. So Ontario's pork producers are sounding that alarm.
When entering the country, please don't bring pork products into the country. That's our #1 concern.
Because, yes, China's issues will drive up the price for Canadian consumers. But if the disease does show up in this country, the cost to both the economy and your grocery bill will be enormous. Peter Armstrong, CBC News, Toronto.
Here are some of the other stories we're following tonight on The National, including a reaction to a Canadian man handed the death penalty in China for drug crimes.
We're very concerned by this sentence. Canada stands firmly opposed to the use of the death penalty everywhere around the world. We think that this is a cruel and inhumane punishment.
This is the second case of its kind this year. In January, another Canadian, Robert Schellenberg, was given the death penalty in China in a separate drug case. Today's sentence further strains relations between Canada and China. We're learning more tonight about Robert Mueller's reaction to how his report was characterized. U.S. media reporting that Mueller was unhappy with how Attorney General William Barr summarized the Russia investigation and wrote him a letter about it in March. Mueller reportedly frustrated that Barr didn't fully capture the context and substance of the investigation's conclusions. Barr is scheduled to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee tomorrow.
Still ahead on The National, a CBC News investigation into the SNC Levelling donations to the Liberal Party a decade ago.
And the pain of balancing the books in Ontario. Will the protests affect the politics?
And shoveling sand to stop the floodwaters. Meet the teenagers pitching in.
Since we have such a large student body that is directly affected, everybody would for sure want to be able to help each other and come together as a community.
That's nice. Their story is in our moment. Angry protesters swarmed the lawns outside Ontario's legislature today. It's getting to be a bit of a regular thing. Demonstrators furious with cuts imposed by the Ford government. Stop, stop, stop! Solidarity! Thousands denounced the planned restructuring of the healthcare system, merging 20 provincial agencies, overhauling funding formulas, eliminating services. Toronto alone says it will lose $1 billion in funding over a decade. Universities and colleges are seeing funding cuts and tuition freezes. Elementary and secondary class sizes will grow, and school boards say teachers will lose jobs. The cuts shouldn't come as a surprise. Doug Ford campaigned on a promise to balance the books. In some eyes, short-term pain for long-term fiscal gain. But as Jamie Strachan tells us, Ford's methods are dividing the province.
9 months ago, more than 2 million Ontarians voted overwhelmingly for change.
This is your victory.
The new Conservative government promised reduced spending and smaller government. The goal? Reducing Ontario's massive debt, something residents voted for.
They'll like the notion and the theory of reducing the deficit. They probably won't like the actions that'll go with it.
There has been a flurry of announcements and considerable pushback. Changes to health care have been especially controversial. Experts say if the government really wants to reduce spending, it will take deep cuts to health and education and the ability to weather protests like this one. Education cuts, too, are causing anxiety. A plan to increase class sizes means teachers like Hardeep Chauhan have been declared surplus, unsure if they will work next year.
What's taking the biggest hit? It sounds like it's the tech courses, the arts, social sciences, all the electives. And if you think about it, these are the courses that kind of make our students the more well-rounded human beings.
The government has reversed course on planned changes to sex education and autism funding after considerable pushback. Drummond says Ford needs to be more strategic in his cuts.
They have shown an inclination to be involved in things for symbolic value, and you can't keep program spending to 1% of growth by dealing with symbolism. You have to go where the money is.
Others say it's too early to gauge the political fallout of these changes.
The government wants to cut, but at the same time understand that if it cuts too much, the consequences may be more severe than what he planned or what he intended.
But Tellier says some voters have short memories. Things that cause anger now may be forgotten come election time. Jamie Strachan, CBC News, Toronto.
Still ahead on The National. Remember this guy? We're going to see him here in just a sec. The Tongan Olympic flag bearer took the world by storm, and now he's back in a brand new sport.
No, I totally don't remember that guy at all, Ian. And feel foggy after a bad night's sleep? Canadian researchers are discovering just how linked sleep and memory are.
I wouldn't necessarily call it the fountain of youth, but I think there's something to be said about its ability to keep our brains healthy as we age.
Jason Kenney hasn't wasted any time after being sworn in as Alberta's new premier today. Tonight, Kenney confirming his government has proclaimed the so-called turn off the taps legislation. That law would limit the oil and gas supply to British Columbia, but his government won't be enforcing it, at least not right away.
We simply want to demonstrate that our government is serious about defending the vital economic interests of Alberta.
British Columbia, though, is launching a constitutional challenge against the law.
I dare you to take a meeting with me.
After posting this powerful video online, Nova Scotia woman Inez Rutherham will get her meeting with the Premier. The 33-year-old was critical of the health system, saying her cancer went undiagnosed for 2 years because she didn't have a family doctor. Now she's been contacted by the Premier's office.
I really didn't expect the phone call, and I didn't expect the conversation to be as positive and open as it was.
The meeting will happen when the Premier returns from a trade mission in Europe. A Senate committee is recommending Ontario Senator Lynn Bayak be suspended for refusing to take letters off her website. They've been widely condemned as racist, some describing Indigenous people as lazy and opportunistic, and that they should be grateful for residential schools. But Bayak argues the letters are edgy and opinionated. The committee is recommending she be suspended from the upper house for the rest of this parliamentary season.
prosecution. We've seen this before. We would like to know whether or not there was conversations between the Prime Minister's office, SNC Levelling, and Elections Canada in this matter.
Yes or no? That's the opposition demanding answers today on SNC Levelling and the Liberals, but this is not the same story that dominated headlines for months. CBC News and Radio-Canada have dug up details on another problem. Harvey Kesheshian takes us through it.
No matter what, it seems that the Liberals just can't escape the SNC Levelling scandal.
They've sat on this information for 3 years. It took investigative reporting to uncover it.
This Prime Minister promised to be different. And we fully comply with all fundraising and donation rules.
This is what caused the uproar. A letter leaked to the Fifth Estate and Radio-Canada's Enquête. It contained a list of 18 senior executives, employees, and some of their spouses, named in an illegal party donation scheme. Corporate donations are banned in Canada, but SNC Levelling was secretly paying those executives to make the donations. On the list, Kathleen Weil, a Liberal member of Quebec's National Assembly and a spouse of a former SNC executive. Today in Quebec City, she admits she donated, but claims she was never reimbursed.
I was never reimbursed, and I was never told about any scheme or any reimbursement. I would never make a donation under those conditions. It's not who I am.
But 2 other employees on that list told the Fifth Estate they were reimbursed after being pressured by SNC's top executives to make the donations. Despite that, in 2016, the Commissioner of Canada Elections decided not to prosecute SNC Levelling after the company promised it would not do it again. And both Canada Elections and the Liberal Party kept the list secret for 3 years.
The Commissioner has a long record of letting people off the hook with these compliance agreements, even for serious violations. And it's, again, the record of a lapdog, not a watchdog.
In the end, only one person was ever charged in the scheme, former SNC Vice President Normand Morin. Last fall, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of violating the Canada Elections Act. He was fined $2,000. He told us it was a mystery to him why others weren't also charged. There was many people. You should aim your investigation towards the parties, he said. The Conservatives also received money in the scheme, though much less than the Liberals. In 2016, both parties agreed to repay the donations to the federal treasury.
We may have moved forward on transparency and openness, and that is not what happens anymore.
Today, Prime Minister Trudeau argued that what happened with SNC was all in the past. In 2016, the party assured Elections Canada no one in their ranks had any knowledge of the scheme while it was happening. What the Prime Minister didn't say, however, is what efforts the party made, if any, to find out. As for SNC Levelling, in a statement today, they said none of the executives involved are with the company anymore. Harvey Kesheshian, CBC News, Ottawa.
Next on The National, more than half of us don't get the sleep we need. Now Canadian researchers are discovering precisely how that affects your brain power.
Being able to leverage new technologies, draw back the curtains and peer inside to see what's happening in the brain while we're sleeping is just fascinating.
All right, come on in, Duncan.
We'll see how Duncan got a front row seat to see the science in action. But first, in Japan, where it's already Wednesday, people celebrated well into the night. A new era is dawning in their country. This hasn't happened in about 2 centuries. At the age of 85, Emperor Akihito is abdicating his position rather than serve until his death. The ceremony is steeped in ancient tradition because Japan has the world's oldest continuing hereditary monarchy. But in the last century, it modernized a bit. Akihito's father was Emperor Hirohito, revered by his people as a living god, but loathed by Allied powers as a ruthless ruler who ordered wartime atrocities. As part of Japan's surrender at the end of the Second World War, Hirohito publicly renounced his divinity. When he died in 1989, Akihito succeeded him as emperor and helped repair Japan's post-war reputation. In recent years, though, Akihito dealt with serious health challenges and strongly hinted he wanted to step down. Parliament had to pass a law to allow it. Crown Prince Naruhito now succeeds his father, and maybe his monarchy might modernize again. Right now, the heir must be a male born to the paternal line. But But the new emperor only has a daughter. Next in line are her uncle and her cousin. We'll see if this ancient line can take a cue from a much younger royal family. Millions of Canadians have a hard time getting enough sleep. A full 40% of us deal with some sort of sleep disorder. And the lack of sleep can exacerbate serious problems, ranging from diabetes to depression. A lack of sleep can also have a major impact on memory. For this story, Duncan McHugh let researchers monitor his brain while he slept. Here's another look at what he learned.
If you want a crash course in what's really going on with your brain when you sleep, follow this guy.
There's so little known compared to other areas of science and neuroscience in particular. It's about the mystery of sleep. Here, so you can see the fluid is the brightest.
Right. Stuart Fogel is a psychology professor and the director of sleep neuroscience at the Royal Ottawa's Institute of Mental Health Research. And I'm getting a front row seat in one of the few places in the world that actually records what happens in the brain during sleep.
Being able to leverage new technologies, draw back the curtains and peer inside to see what's happening in the brain while we're sleeping is just fascinating.
All right, come on in, Duncan.
This is how it begins, my journey into the world of sleep, to understand why we can't do without it.
60% of Canadians don't get the sleep that they need or the sleep that they want. It's quite a big number. Yeah.
That's a huge, over half of us are not getting as much sleep as we want.
That's right. It's a big question.
Fogel is halfway through a 4-year research project uncovering connections between sleep and memory.
And a lot of what sleep is good for has to do with memory. People are really gaining a lot of interest in this because there seems to be so much about sleep. The more we do study this, the more we find how there's just so many aspects of sleep that are involved in memory processing.
Okay. Just have you close your eyes, please.
To show me why sleep is so critical to how we learn, I'm not actually going to sleep.
All right, Duncan, we're going to get started with the task now. We're going to be
Not right away. First, a skill test.
The tower of discs that you see on the left, that you're going to want to move those all the way to the right, but you can only move...
Using my fingers on this keypad, I have to move those colored blocks from left to right. All of it captured by this $10 million MRI machine.
So he's nearly got the whole strategy figured out, not in an optimal sense.
These images show different parts of the brain activating while it struggles to learn the task. The same kind of brain activity occurs during sleep, and to Fogel, that's a crucial discovery.
And what we see is with a period of sleep that people just arrive at this aha moment where they've arrived at the solution, the optimal solution to the puzzle that they couldn't necessarily get to before they had sleep.
That's it. You're all done.
All right. It's a motor skill thing too. The third finger is like, come on. Work.
So does that mean the more sleep you get, the better your memory? Well, to a point, and as Fogel has learned, up to a certain age. To better understand how memory and sleep change as we age, we recruited 60-year-old Tom Patterson. He's my fellow lab rat in the sleep lab tonight. Well, Fogel runs us through more tests.
Hi, Tom Patterson.
Hi, Tom. Stuart Fogel.
Tom is what scientists describe as an optimal aging adult.
Super.
So this is someone that is really healthy and in sort of ticks all the boxes for the different measurements that we use. They're physically active. They aren't on any medications. They have no sleep complaints.
Tom fits the bill on all fronts, and most importantly, he shows no early warning signs of dementia.
How much are you hearing older people say that they're worried about premature dementia or memory loss?
Almost every subject who enrolls in the study, I would say.
I certainly think about it now because I'm 60, and
I think about that kind of thing. Oh, Jesus, I wonder if my memory's getting worse. Why did I go to the garage? You remember halfway back to the house, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Fridge moments. Opening up the fridge. What's in there?
Yes.
Just
Exactly.
standing there.
Exactly.
Just I don't know what I was looking for. Yeah.
They pick up the electrical activity that's just naturally going on in your brain.
Then, time to get wired up. These electrodes will document our brainwaves throughout the night.
What time do you normally go to bed?
We've also enlisted 23-year-old doctoral student Nick Vanderberg to show how differently a young brain deals with memory and sleep.
When you see the green cross, that means to practice. So 4-1-3-2-4, 4-1-3-2-4, as quickly and as accurately as possible.
Okay, time for another motor skills test. And it ain't easy.
This is hard work. Onto all of these, I'll have you hold on to this side. Perfect.
A few more wires to hook up because I didn't look Frankenstein-y enough. And then finally, time for bed.
It should be really easy to sleep tonight. Good.
Duncan, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So you're just gonna make yourself comfortable in the bed and you're off to sleep for the night?
Okay.
All right, good night. Okay, that's everybody.
Good morning. How did you sleep?
Bright and early, we get another go at finger tapping to see if we learned anything as we slept.
What was it like to do it this morning?
It seemed it was quicker initially.
I totally felt like I was faster this morning.
You felt it, eh?
Oh, I could feel it the first couple of goes, but then it started to slow down, and I think it had more to. It felt to me like it was just because it was morning. I was like, "Oh, brain not working." But I could.
First,
Yeah, needed coffee.
Before we find out if we were, in fact, any faster.
All right, Duncan, so we're going to go through the results of your test, your overnight recording.
Stuart Fogel takes a moment to decipher my brainwaves. He's looking for something called sleep spindles. Spindles are evidence our brain is shifting tasks we learn every day from short-term memory to long-term.
What we can see here, now that you're fully asleep, is some nice sleep spindles, these bursts of activity, very large amplitude, nice long duration sleep spindle there. Other ones here as well. So your brain is really working hard there.
I'm so happy I have good sleep spindles. But what's my brain doing when I have a sleep spindle?
That indicates that you're probably reprocessing that information, reactivating those memory traces, integrating them into long-term memory stores.
Overnight, my spindles were on overdrive, which means I was probably practicing the test without being aware of it. How did I compare to Tom and Nick? Time to find out. We're about to see who was actually better at the motor skills / memory task after we slept.
And so what you see here is what we would have predicted.
On this graph, a lower bar means a faster performance.
Nick, who's our younger subject, has the benefit from sleep. So
Nick's got speed fingers.
So he got a lot faster here. Yeah, that's quite a good improvement in terms of speed. The blue is the training session, so that was the evening when you were learning it for the first time, and then the red bars are the retest, so that's the morning session where we want to see how well you did after a night of sleep. What we see here is very typical in a younger subject like Nick, where they start off at a certain level there, and then they improve after a night of sleep. Duncan, we see a similar sort of thing here. You're a little bit slower overall, but you do still get a little boost from sleep.
That's the eureka moment. A good night's sleep boosts your brain power.
So the boost is really what you're honing in on to show us how important the sleep is.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if we're not getting the sleep, then that boost is really important.
That boost doesn't happen. That boost only happens with sleep. He's learning the task just.
But for Tom, as expected, there was no boost at all.
Is that as we get older, we don't derive the same benefit from sleep. So Tom doesn't have that boost after sleep, that improvement from at retest that sleep seems to afford.
It's showing me that I'm getting older and I'm right where my age group should be, and I'm not, it's not bad or a critical memory loss. It's just indicative of my age.
Our sleep patterns undoubtedly change as we age, but Fogel hopes if we improve our sleep, it will help treat, maybe even ward off, dementia.
The moral of the story would be to do everything you can to make sleep a priority, and to eliminate the things that are going to interfere with sleep, because sleep definitely can stand to provide a benefit and perhaps even stave off things like dementia. I wouldn't necessarily call it the fountain of youth, but I think there's something to be said about its ability to keep our brains healthy as we age.
Going to bed right after this. Ahead on The National, how high school students in Ottawa are pitching in with the flood relief, one sandbag at a time.
I feel very lucky to be part of such a school that's so helpful in everything happening with the community. I think this school is helping so very much.
Their day-long effort is tonight's moment, but first.
Well, it must be hot out there.
Holy smoke!
Show off.
In case you missed it, nobody embodies the Olympic spirit more than Tongan athlete Pita Tafatafua. He basically broke the internet at the 2016 Rio Summer Games opening ceremonies, proudly wearing his national costume, shirtless and glistening. And despite crashing out of the first round of Taekwondo, Tafatafua's sportsmanship made him a global fan favorite. Yeah, that's the only reason. 2 years later, at the Korean Winter Games, he again rocked the six-pack before competing as a cross-country skier.
Wonderful. Peter Tafatafua, 23 minutes behind Dario Colonia.
The whole year, my training was just on roller skis. We had no snow.
He didn't win that either, which is hardly surprising. He's from the tropics. But guess what? He's back. Well, maybe. The Tongan Titan hopes to make a three-peat appearance at the 2020 Summer Games in Tokyo in two events, Taekwondo again and sprint kayak. But first, he has to qualify for each, which could be tough. He says he hasn't really done Taekwondo for 2 years, and as for kayaking, well, he tends to capsize the boat. So that could be a problem, but, you know, fingers crossed.
On your marks, get set, go! Yes!
This is CBC News.
If the story matters to you, you can always turn to us. CBC News, right where you are.
For these high school students in the Ottawa area, flooding is personal. This is their community, and they've been looking for a way to help. So today, they put their shovels to the ground, and together they filled more than 10,000 sandbags. Their impressive effort is tonight's moment.
We kind of had like a team of four. One person was putting it into the bag, one person was shoveling, one person was tying, and then someone was carrying it to like this huge pile that we had of all our bags. And from there, once trucks came in, we would take the bags and put them into the truck.
Well, the city of Ottawa kept bringing truckloads full of sand.
Everyone was helping. Everyone was saying that like this is amazing. And like I know a lot of my friends were affected personally, so they were like really happy seeing everyone doing this.
I live in Constance Bay, so ever since this started, I've been at the community center, and it was just as organized as over there, like here.
We've had the tornado in Dunrobin, and like school just seems to get closer and closer with these kind of things, and it's amazing to see this kind of participation.
It's cool to see everybody moving together as a unit with one common goal, because in high school generally you have different personalities, so you have some different friend groups per se who normally would be doing the same thing, but like Michelle said, everybody just comes together and works together, and that's really cool to see in a group of teenagers.
It is very cool to see on our moment. You know, Rosie, good educators all the time are talking about seeking that teachable moment, and how perfect was this? It unified the school. We know the students, we saw in our notes that they loved it, and it really connects them to the community. So good for them.
Yeah, and it's the same community that Olivia Stefanovic was in the other day, the same community that's been hit by flood, a tornado, and another flood. And back in the tornado, the same high school got together and seemed to raise more than $10,000 for people that were hit by that. So just a school that's got the right sense of community spirit and giving back. And now I'm going to have to do some sandbags because I feel bad. I'll have to get out there. That's the National for Tuesday, April 30th. Good night.
Good night.